Welcome to this Writing Services presentation series on thesis structures, genre analysis, and thesis mapping, a guide for your thesis writing. My name is Jodie Salter, and I'm with Writing Services in the McLaughlin Library at the University of Guelph. This series has been divided into 3 shorter presentations, with each focusing on one key strategy to help you better understand the expected structure of your thesis or dissertation and the essential components. This specific presentation focuses on thesis mapping, a visual tool that allows writers to stand back and see their entire project as a whole, and how the individual sections fit in conversation with each other. This tool is useful from the beginning writing stages through to final revisions and preparing for your oral defense. This presentation will introduce 3 common styles of thesis maps, explain their function and purpose, and it will conclude with a mapping activity. In a previous video in this workshop series, we looked at the Atrium, the University of Guelph's institutional repository, a site where we could analyze other theses for their style, their format, and for content. We also talked about the essential components of a thesis and how they fit together to create a cohesive document. Now that we have a better idea of how our own thesis should be structured and which thesis style it should adhere to, I want to introduce you to an extremely useful visual strategy that helps us capture our ideas and content in an organized and logical structure. These 3 templates that you see here represent the most common style of theses: the traditional simple, traditional complex, and topic-based. We can provide you with examples of all 3 maps. Thesis maps are a multi-page document, best printed on 11 by 17 sheets of paper to give you a lot of space to work with. As seen in this picture, the thesis map can be laid out side by side, capturing an entire thesis on one wall. Each sheet of paper represents one chapter. A thesis map is a template, and like any template, it can be modified to best reflect the sections and structure of a thesis in our specific discipline. A thesis map helps create a section-by-section breakdown of a larger document. It helps us to determine where concepts and ideas go into the text. It helps us explain how individual parts fit together. It creates a visual of different sections in conversation with one another. It helps us as writers move from start to finish without getting lost. It also helps us as writers understand the big picture. I don't think it was until I was almost finished my entire dissertation before I truly understood my project, because I was so immersed in the writing of the individual sections. So this strategy provides a map that shows you how your project, your research, and your argument logically develop and contributes throughout each section of your thesis. I will start with the topic-based thesis mapping template because it's the first one I created back in 2014. This image we see here is the master template. It's the first page of the workbook, which has 8 pages in total in this specific thesis map. Each column represents a chapter, with the introduction on the far left, followed by the literature review, then multiple chapters comprising the middle section of the thesis, and the conclusion on the far right. The number of body chapters in the middle depends upon the length of the thesis. For example, a master's thesis might have 2 chapters in the middle, whereas a doctoral dissertation might have 5 to 6 chapters. Under each column, the boxes include key information, and these sections are useful for helping writers focus on writing one section at a time. This focus on writing smaller sections can help decrease anxiety about writing a larger document. The first column of this master template corresponds with the second page of the workbook. This page provides a space to begin to fill in sections of the introductory chapter. Here, we can capture ideas for each section and begin to clarify what needs to be said in each of the essential components. Not all theses will include every section presented here. For example, a thesis in English most likely will not list objectives, but it would include a justification for the project. To modify this template to best suit your needs, look at other theses in the atrium to gain a clear understanding of the specific structure and essential components for a thesis in your discipline. The final column, the conclusion, corresponds with page 7 in the workbook. Here, we have space to begin to make notes for ourselves of what we need to capture in the conclusion of our thesis. Thus, each column in the master template has a corresponding sheet in the workbook, where we can begin to gather our ideas and begin writing in sections. This is a traditional simple thesis mapping template, which was introduced in the thesis structure presentation in this video series. Across the top of this master template, we see the main chapters listed: the introduction, the theoretical framework and literature review, plus methods, findings and/or results, discussion, and conclusion. In the introduction column, we see sections for each essential component that a reader expects to find in this chapter. At the bottom, we see the chapter breakdown. Not all theses include this section, and yet it provides an important outline for your reader, indicating exactly what you will address in this thesis and where they can find that information. This chapter breakdown is also useful as a guide for you when you are thinking through and organizing the content for each of the chapters. In some disciplines, such as sociology, the theoretical framework will appear as its own chapter and oftentimes before the literature review. However, in some cases, the theoretical framework and the literature review are combined into one chapter. When you're looking at example theses in the atrium, take note of how this information is structured. This could be a discussion point for you and your supervisor. This master template is an example of the traditional complex thesis mapping template. You will remember from the thesis structure presentation that this thesis structure is common when you have multiple studies included in one thesis project. You will need a general introduction chapter and a general conclusion chapter to justify why these studies are gathered as one project. Sometimes the literature review will be embedded within the introduction as a general review of literature on the broad research topic area. Often, smaller literature reviews are included within each separate chapter, introducing the reader to the specific literature relevant to the research question of that specific study. This organizational structure is an important discussion to have with your supervisor. This clinical studies thesis mapping template is similar to the traditional complex. Again, there are variations as to whether the literature review is part of the introduction or separated out into its own chapter. Like the traditional complex, we see multiple studies that could be published as separate articles. As a reminder, the thesis maps are templates only. They are to serve as guides for your writing process and should be modified to best reflect the sections and structure of a thesis in your specific discipline and to meet the expectations of your specific supervisor. I want to show you a couple of examples of what students have done with thesis maps. The large image on the left is page 2, the Introduction to the Topic-Based Thesis Map workbook. This student has used color to visually group information. The picture in the top right corner I spoke about in an earlier presentation. This student used the thesis mapping concept for an individual chapter, in this case chapter 6. Sticky notes work well because they can be moved around to change the order of the information. The bottom right corner shows a master template of a topic-based thesis that a PhD student created during dissertation boot camp. Using the provided template, this student entered his own information into each box and used the document to create an outline for what he needed to expand upon in that specific section. He spent most of the week during DBC creating this outline. This mapping exercise helped him clarify his ideas, organize the structure in a logical progression, and this outline guided him as he began to write each section as a piece of the whole document. Following DBC, he spent the next 3 months writing his dissertation, finished successfully, and he's now a professor teaching in his discipline. I want to conclude this presentation with a thesis mapping activity. After we read through these instructions together, pause the presentation and begin working on your own thesis map. Here are the instructions. First, determine which style or format you need for a thesis in your discipline. You might need to refer back to the table of contents analysis exercise in the thesis structure presentation. From the templates provided, the traditional simple, traditional complex, or topic-based, choose one mapping template, or perhaps you will need to combine two to create a blended template. This activity works best if you can print the workbook. These templates are usually printed on large 11 by 17 sheets of paper. During regular hours of operation, you can pick up printed templates in the McLaughlin Library's Writing Center. However, as most home printers only print 8 by 10 sheets, I recommend sticky notes to add to individual sections. You can also complete this activity on a digital copy, but I encourage you to step away from the computer and allow yourself the time to think with pen and paper. Begin to fill in details for the introduction section. You can use bullet points or full sentences. When you are finished, move to the next section that you're currently working on or want to start planning. Remember, some sections may not apply to your research or disciplinary areas. Modify the template based on your table of contents analysis and from your supervisor's feedback. Pause this presentation now. Download a copy of the thesis map, and if you have access to a printer, I strongly encourage you to print a workbook. Set a 25-minute Pomodoro timer for yourself and begin working on your thesis mapping workbook. When you are finished, resume this presentation. Next steps in the thesis mapping process. Write down any questions that you need to ask your supervisor. Do you need clarity about the scope of your project or about the structure and organization of your thesis? Do they have recommendations of well-written theses? Do you need clarity about variations that you've seen in other theses? Make a list of questions and book a meeting with your supervisor. Bring your thesis map to this meeting to show that you have thought through the logic and order of your information. If you're a University of Guelph student or faculty and you need support on any of the topics discussed in this presentation, you can book an appointment on the library webpage. You will find details about the various library support services listed here. Thank you for watching. I'm Jodie Salter, and I hope you gained something useful from this presentation. If you have questions, you can email writing services at writing@uoguelph.ca or visit the library website at lib.uguelph.ca. This concludes the 3 presentations in this series: Thesis Structures, Genre Analysis, and Thesis Mapping, a guide for your thesis writing.